Well, welcome to the Glenwood Table podcast. I am Reverend Lana Hurst, and my pronouns are she, her. So I'm so excited to be back this evening with everyone here. So we have a multitude of guests. Everyone here has been on the podcast at some point, but we also had our first Keeping Christ in Christmas group conversation, and everyone is back again. And we have an additional person. I'll let her introduce herself in a bit. But tonight, the theme of the conversation is, why do you still identify as a Christian? So we'll get into this a bit and talk about what that word means for us and what it sparks for us, and what tensions do we hold around that word? What do we love about it? And maybe what we don't love about it. So to start us off, I'll open up the floor for everyone to introduce yourself. You can tell us a little bit about who you are, the kind of work you do, whatever you want us to know about you.
I was expecting to be called out, but since no one was called out, I'll jump in there. I'm JJ. I pastor the Emmanuel Congregational Church, United Church of Christ in Watertown, New York, and just celebrated being here for a little over a year. And so I'm really happy to be a part of this conversation.
Congratulations on your year there.
Thank you. Thank you.
I feel like that's a huge accomplishment, I am Virginia Goss, and I am a hospital chaplain in Brooklyn, New York, and work at a hospital here at a trauma center. And I am also a member in the PCUSA Church, and I'm trying to think of other things that are interesting. I'm sure other things will be unfolded as we continue our conversation. How about that? Those are the main things to know about me.
Oh, Virginia, I think you're really interesting and so much fun.
Thanks, Don, you're the best.
All right. I guess I should go next. My name is Don Van Antwerp, and I'm the pastor of Unfinished Community, which is a interesting church. I hesitant to give location, but basically it's partly physical here in Kobe, Japan, but also largely online. At the moment, we have more members online than in person, so that tells you everything you want to know about that. We've been experimenting with new ways of doing worship, new ways of being community, and basically live as a church on Discord, which is a totally weird place for a church to be, but a whole heck of a lot of fun. I've been at that for about a year, and I'm excited to see where that's going to go. And in the meantime, I think about half of the people on this podcast have been on my own podcast as well. So I think we're all this wonderful tight-knit community here. And I'm looking at the other two thinking just, okay, I got a spot on the schedule for you two yet.
Always down. Yep.
I love that so much. My name is Emmy Arnold. I'm a reverend in the Presbyterian Church, which is the church that many people on this podcast either work within or have been ordained through, or did some of their ordination process with, and then found happier, healthier routes elsewhere in their lives. And I use my ministry. I do ministry at hospitals mainly as a hospital chaplain, but I also do some communications work like I do for Glenwood Table. And I get to do lots of pulpit supply, which is super fun. Get to go lead a church for a day. And I love that.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much. So to come back to our question, why do you identify as a Christian, or why do you still identify as a Christian? The question already presents a frame. The question brings us to a place of maybe some assumptions about people not wanting to identify as a Christian, or there being tension around identifying as a Christian. And so let's start there. When you hear that question, what comes up for you?
I don't know. I think what initially comes up for me is I assume when someone's asking that question, there's a lot of pain behind it. That's what it kind of brings up for me. So I immediately think, how has as a Christian or groups of Christians hurt you, and wanting to have a conversation about that.
Yeah. So it's more focused on the other person's experience. It doesn't necessarily evoke your own experience.
Well, I think usually in my experiences with other people, I think it helps me connect with myself more. And I think, to be honest, I probably have avoided that question for myself, which is probably an answer in itself, I'm assuming.
The question of why are you still a Christian?
Sure.
That's the question you're saying you've avoided?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to piggyback on that for a second, if I can. I love it because Virginia, you and I kind of impact that in almost the same place, but also totally different spaces. When I hear that question, my first thought is, how have I shared that experience of getting hurt by the church? And I'm going to harken that back to some of my own unique background for a second. I'll get a little autobiographical here for a minute. I've talked about this on the podcast before, but I grew up in the kind of one of the conservative hubs of the Reformed Church in America. Super conservative area for Christianity, at least for mainstream Christianity anyway. And I was always that guy who was like, wait, why do we hate gays? Is there something actually wrong with people of other races? Because that ain't anywhere in the Bible. Wait, Jesus never actually said that thing. What are you going on about? It did not make me a popular person. So I got my butt kicked in church a lot. And so when I talk, like a lot of people who are members of my own church community right now are people who have come there because they've been hurt by so many other churches and are just looking for a place that's not going to do that anymore. That's kind of our focus. And so for me, like, I hear that and I get the same focus that you do, but I also am like, I kind of feel that a little bit myself. And I think a lot of us who are still in ministry, and I can speak for myself at least on this, are people who have kind of got their butts kicked by institutional Christianity and have done the whole war doctor thing and said, okay, no more.
You see lots of head nodding. I wonder what's going on for some of the others here.
So I really appreciate this question because it takes me back to being in systematic theology at Princeton Seminary,
where we all
listening
went.
to
Yes,
Stacy Johnson.
Yeah.
Dr. Stacy Johnson. He asked the question, or he posed the question that we should ask ourselves, which was, which Christianity am I going to inhabit? And that question in and of itself opened up the notion for me that there was not one form of Christianity that we all live into. And so I think to get to the heart of the question, at least for me, why I still call myself a Christian, I can still call myself a Christian because Christianity for me has taken on many forms over the years. And so as I've grown, so has my Christianity. And this idea that I work for, serve, represent a God that is committed to the liberation of marginalized people has bought me hook, line, and sinker. If it were not for that kind of outlook on Christianity, I think I would have gave up on it a long time ago.
Yeah. So JJ, what you just said resonates deeply for me. I think I was talking to someone earlier and I was actually having a conversation with my spiritual director this week. And I was saying that, I took this class recently called Sacramental Spirituality with a bunch of mostly Catholics. And I was like, I'm not sure how this is gonna go. Here I am, the Protestant kid in class. I'm like much younger than everyone else. And I loved that class. I was like, these are my people. And it reaffirmed for me that the Christian tent is very wide, that it's humongous. And we could say that there's not just one tent, that there are many tents. And what it reaffirmed for me, though, is there's a place for me in this tent. And I know that there are other people who are thinking similar or the same things as I do within this tent. And that is something that pulls me back into the tent over and over again. Because I know that I'm not alone in the way that I experience my Christianity.
I really appreciate the image of like the tent and like what kind of Christianity will you inhabit? Because I think it draws us to a more responsible faith to some extent of like understanding our neighbors' expressions of faith, but also when I first became a Christian and saw terrible things being done in God's name, I'd be like, oh, those people aren't real Christians. And that sort of, took me out of the conversation of like, well, what is it that I can do to make Christian practice more liberatory in the world? Like, how do I talk to my neighbors rather than just being like, well, people who love God and guns clearly aren't Christians, or like people who brought Jesus Saves posters to the insurrection at the White House clearly aren't Christians, because that removes my responsibility, right? That removes my responsibility of like seeing where white supremacy is stitched into American Christianity. So like understanding the tent as both like very wide, and understanding the tent as very wide is like both very challenging in that way of being like, well, wow, some of my siblings in Christ are acting in kind of ugly ways and would say similar things about me, I'm sure. And yet, as you're saying, Lana, it's also a very liberatory thing to have the tent be wide, because it means that there's space for mystics and people who read literally and people who read more figuratively and metaphorically, or people who focus in on like one particular area of theology and like focus on, like certain aspects of God, as JJ said, where like, if we're not focusing on those like beautiful aspects of God that build more freedom into the world, why bother being in a tent where like there are membership fees and things like that sometimes, and each of us probably have hundreds of wrinkles that relate directly to the church, and I'm seeing some smiles and nods, and I'm feeling very affirmed by that, because ministry is hard, and I mean being a religious person is hard in general. And so the wide tent, I think, is both one of the hardest things at times and also one of the best things that I've discovered the more that I get into like my sort of like more mature Christianity that leaves more space for the perplexity of things rather than simplicity of things.
I'm going to be that guy and throw a wrench into things for a minute because I love a good conversation. I've always taken a little bit of issue with the whole wide tent sort of imagery, and particularly I love that you talk about your conflict early on with, well, those aren't really Christians. And the argument I always have is, well, at what point do we draw boundaries? So you talk about like membership fees and stuff like that. It's not really worth drawing a boundary. To back it up a little bit, in our community's Discord server, we've been having a discussion based on random quotes from James Cone that I've been dropping into a thread, because that's how I do. And this quote was literally the one that's next on the table here, and it kind of relates it, so I'm gonna read it out here real quick. It, in this case, Christian theology, is either identified with those who inflict oppression or those who are its victims. A theology of the latter is authentic Christian theology, and a theology of the former is a theology of the Antichrist. I love the way that the man's not unwilling to throw down, particularly on issues of justice and liberation. But I think that, we talk about having a wide tent. And that's a great idea. But tents are three-dimensional objects. A wide tent doesn't necessarily have to be a long tent, for example, and figuring out where those boundaries are, particularly on issues of justice and liberation, I think an unwillingness to do that is part of the reason why we have a cohesive conservative Christianity and a wildly incoherent and incohesive liberal Christianity in America right now.
I mean, what comes up for me is a sense in which, while I certainly want to draw boundaries and I certainly want to say, well, your Christianity is not authentic. And at the same time, I think about how even though I do that, I don't really have the power to take the name Christian out of their mouth.
Yeah.
Like, I think about how I don't have the social power to do that. They have already claimed it. They've already claimed the name Christian. I think this is where the tension is for me, is that, right, they already have institutional, social, cultural power to claim the name Christian. And so I think we need to speak the truth and say, I would say that that's not an authentic Christianity. And I also recognize that me saying that doesn't change the cultural power that they have. I think it may, I mean, it certainly does. I'm not saying there's no power in saying that, because I do think there is power. And then I think people hear what you're saying and you are creating a different reality for people. I mean, I was having a conversation similar to this about somebody who was like, oh, we should support this organization. And one of the reasons was that it was a Christian organization. But again, I brought it back to, well, what does Christian mean? When they say that, what does it mean? Because it doesn't mean the same thing. I don't know. That's one of the things, when I hear Christian, I feel uncomfortable. If I'm honest, like when somebody says I'm a Christian, I'm like, oh, I'm probably not that kind of Christian.
Well, let me throw out for you something. Any of you guys big C.S. Lewis fans? I ask knowing that at least some
complex relationship.
I think complex relationship is fair for any theologian born before like 15 minutes ago. But
especially as a white man too, by the way. Sorry.
Yeah, especially white man Christians. I say as a white man Christian. And one of the things that always stuck with me in his, I think it's in the intro to Mere Christianity, or the first chapter, so right near the beginning, C.S. Lewis goes on this rant about the definition of the term Christian. And one of the things that I loved is how, and I preached a whole sermon on this a while back, but he likened it to the term gentleman, which originally had a very specific meaning. It had a meaning of, this is a person who owns land and has a position within the government that is respective to these particular factors. And if you didn't have that, it wasn't a value judgment. It wasn't an esoteric sort of thing. It was just, you're either this or you're not. It's just a functional distinction. His argument went on to say that the term Christian was, at least for a time, relatively similar. You are a Christian in that you are someone who adheres to the teachings of Jesus Christ. Literally a Christ in. Or a wayist or a Jesus freak, or whatever term you want to use if you're a late 90s youth pastor. But going forward, the term Christian began to become internalized as if it no longer describes outwardly characteristics or a place within the teachings of a specific teacher, but something abstract and spiritual that is up to the individual to define. And what he goes on to describe is there's a real loss that happened within Christendom and within society when that shift happened. When Christians ceased to become something that has verifiable characteristics that are related to the teachings of Jesus and started being something that has to do solely with your own spiritual piety and your own personal walk. And then it becomes something that no one can define, and so the term becomes functionally meaningless. And I know that talking about how do we define a Christian and how the way it used to be, and these terms have shifted over the years, coming from a white male Christian mouth is just a stupid thing to sound on the surface of it. But I think there is something to understanding how that definition shift operates and thinking about what it means to be a Christian.
I appreciate the importance of like realizing of like Christianity used to be very much more like outward. And then like, especially in American Christianity, it became like my personal salvation, my personal walk with Jesus. Like, don't talk to me about my relationship with God. Like, we got this, you know. And then like, there's the ever controversial, like, I'm a Christian, but I don't go to church quote, because, you know, like half the people who say that will get a response of like, well, you can't be a Christian and not go to church because church is like it, you like being part of the body of Christ is sort of like required. Or you've got the people who are like, yeah, that's fine, but you have no idea what's going on in the head of that person, you know, like as you're, you know, that person who's sort of the one you're describing in the Intro to Mere Christianity is like not a value judgment on them, just sort of like, is anyone on that walk with them? And is that important?
And I think I might even go further to say that if you're not on that walk, if you're not like meeting the functional criteria of Christianity, that in and of itself isn't a value judgment. If you aren't but want to be, hey, let me help you. I got lots of ways to help you walk that path. But like it doesn't necessarily have to be a value judgment.
So I wanted to jump in here really quickly and say, we've been talking a lot about an individualistic Christianity, and I think that brand of Christianity is true of, here's my line in the sand. I think that brand of Christianity is true of white evangelical fundamentalism. I don't see the same thing in the Black Christian community, and I think I can offer that pushback. Number one, as a Black man, and that's not to say that I'm an expert on Black Christianity, right? But it is to say that my experience is one of a communal faith. And one that says that we worship a God who is committed to our liberation, and we worship that God together as we work toward our liberation as a community. So I actually did not encounter the narrative of a personal savior who wanted to live inside of me when I prayed a prayer, until I went into a predominantly white megachurch, and that was the way that they kind of, forgive my phrasing here, that was the way they herded masses of people into the gates of Christianity.
Well, that's appropriate phrasing right there.
Well,
Absolutely.
I feel bad about it, but playing really melodic music and making things very emotional and calling you down to the altar and having you raise your hands and then praying a prayer saying, Jesus, I welcome you into my heart. I make you the Lord of my life. And none of this has to do with the liberation of the community or the faith of the community, which is very different than the community of faith that I grew up in. And so, I think part of the reason, going back to this original question, part of the reason why I can still identify as a Christian is because I was given a glimpse at a very early age of what it meant to be a Christian in community and what that did for our community to move closer and closer to liberation for all of us.
I really want to thank you for throwing that out there too. And I say from my very esoteric place as a progressive Protestant Christian who's working on building community in opposition to evangelical communities in non-American locations, we look to the Black church for a model on how to do that. I mean, honestly, the Black American church is what we're trying to replicate. We're not trying to copy US white churches when we do church building in that particular context, because you're absolutely right. That focus on community is an essential component. And that focus on individuality, I say this to take my pastor hat off and put my historian hat on for a minute. It's not Jesus worship, it's America worship. Like that is a huge part of fundamental American culture that has become almost an idol in white Christian communities over the very Christian focus on, you know, we're the OG communists here, y'all. I mean, that's who we are, and losing that in favor of that individual relationship is totally American idolatry.
Mm. So when we've been talking about this like community aspect, when the Christianity that I grew up with, I wouldn't necessarily that my parents ascribed to this or anything like that, but the Christianity that I was around felt like country club Christianity, where you want to be a part of the group, right? And this is a very like social aspect. And you know, do you attend this church or whatever? And your entire sort of identity as a human being is around that. Now, the individualistic part, right? Like my personal connection with God and relationship with God, I think was a source of shame for me, right? There's like continual comparison with other people of, I don't have the walk or quote unquote whatever that is that this person does, and so I of course feel bad about myself, but I'm going to continue to save face and stay in the community and like it'll be fine. So I think for myself it's been looking for that balance of my own individual connection with God and functioning within a community that promotes the things that I feel like I'm called to as a Christian. And I think my faith journey so far has been this pendulum swinging of trying to figure out where like the moderation for me is in that. Yeah.
I know you're all getting sick of me throwing random stuff out here, but I'll throw this one more out here. I love the highlighting of the individual faith walk and comparatives and how that can do damage. One thing I've encountered with Japanese folk who are in the process of becoming Christian is there's this period of time from when they've kind of reached that relationship with Christ, where they've become part of the community, they're worshiping regularly, but they're not ready to get baptized. They're not ready to officially call themselves Christian because they're comparing their faith walk to everyone else's and saying, well, I'm definitely not good enough for this. I'm not there yet. And I've been so immersed in that from the Japanese perspective, I haven't actually considered what that was like for people existing within communities in the US. So thank you for bringing that as a whole aspect I hadn't considered.
Hearing this individualistic bend about Christianity makes me wonder about the impact of capitalism on our Christianity. And the reason why I say that is because capitalism is all about being a producer of something. And so like, it is amazing to me how that ideology has crept into faith communities, whether it be Christianity or otherwise, where people feel as though they have to compare their personal piety to someone else, to be able to say, I'm a better fill in the blank because I do all of these things to make myself seem more pious. And I think this conversation is really, I really appreciate it because it's bringing me back to the center of why in the world do I keep doing this work? Like some days I wake up and I'm like, screw the church, screw Christianity, screw it all, right? And then there are other days where I'm like, I really feel called to this thing. And I think this conversation is one of those moments where wrestling with why I'm still in this thing and why I still call myself a Christian is really because I believe there's something to be redeemed in the faith that we hold dear. Even if we're holding it loosely, we hold dear to it because it brought us to a certain point. And I think in all of us, in some way, shape, or form, we're trying to get back to some semblance of why we came into this particular family of faith in the first place. What was it that won us over? At least that's what I'm trying to get back to. And for me, I can't do that without thinking about it in the context of the Black church and what it meant to be shaped in Sunday school classes and VBS and all of those things, not so that I could be saved from hell, but so that I would see the value in understanding that we all are not, that just because I'm free doesn't mean that everybody's free, and we all are not free until everybody's free. So,
well, liberation is a process, and I'm gonna turn to the camera here and look directly at all the white people who are listening right now, and say, from my own experience, we read like liberation theology and stuff like that. We're like, oh, there's the liberation theology for the Black people, and there's the liberation theology for the South American people, and that's great that they have liberation. They can be just like us. Even the most progressive white folk tend to think that way. And you talking about the church and capitalism brings me to a question that I don't think us mainline white Protestants ask very much, if at all, which is, what can and should we be liberated from? And if your answer isn't capitalism, then you're wrong. Because like we talk about liberation as if it applies to esoteric communities who are fundamentally not us, because as we talk about with that individualistic streak we were identifying, we're white American Christians. We are freedom, we are individual, we are liberated. But the thing is, we also have things that we could stand to be liberated from as well. And we can learn from communities who have started down the path of liberation. And I'm definitely not going to ever say that the Black community or the South American community has completed liberation. That's definitely not a thing. But we can look at these other communities who have started down that path, and rather than saying, oh, good for you in that condescending white way we're also very good at, we can instead look to them and learn about what it means to be Christian and to surrender ourselves to Jesus and learn from that process of liberation and grow into what it means to be Christian, rather than simply saying, I have completed Christianity, good job, GG everyone, game over. Which is kind of how a lot of us tend to do it.
And as we talk about this, I want to add some nuance here, because for me, I think individualism in its extreme is unhelpful, but I don't think erasure of the individual is helpful. I don't think that denying that Christianity has an individual piece to it is helpful, because I think the reality is, so this comes largely from my own experience being nurtured by a Black church and in the Pentecostal tradition, where I first learned what it was to be individually touched by God, to be known by God as an individual, and then to see myself as part of the whole. Like it was a both and. It's not an either or. It's the non-dual consciousness. It's holding the tension. It's the paradox. It is the individual and the community, never an either or, but a both and, I would say. And so I always want to hold those things together. It makes me think of Paul Tillich, actually. And Paul Tillich was all about, his whole theology was these paradoxes and how we find the tension between these poles. And so I think that's, for me, in my own experience of Christianity, like, I think that's one of the things that keeps me coming to it, is the individual transformation that I myself have known in community, and the way that I know that community shapes me and enables me to be me, that I know myself because I know us. And I think we know us because we know ourselves and bring ourselves into the space, right? I think that I don't know, it also makes me think of, I'm blanking out the name. What's I am because we are, I'm blanking on it. Ubuntu theology. There we go. Thank you. Yeah, like that's another, I think, framing that comes to my mind in terms of these polarities and how we think about their connection.
I'm reminded of a great Christian theologian who once described the best community as not uniform, but one that practices infinite diversity and infinite combinations. Wait, hold on. No, that was the Vulcans. Never mind. But it's still valid. And I think that's a really good way to look at it, is that we talk about Christianity not as being this kind of uniform measures, we're all the same, but as one that exists in the tension of that infinite diversity functioning in infinite combinations, but united under one banner.
Yeah, I mean, I think white Christianity is about uniformity. It's about look like us, think like us, act like us, right? Especially evangelical fundamentalist
Believe like us
Christianity.
too, right?
And
Us, me.
yeah, and so I think being able to open that up to unity is not uniformity. They're not the same thing. They're being able to hold the paradoxes. It's not when Paul says there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for we are all one in Christ Jesus. I think there's a way in which people read that as, well, those things don't matter, they're erased. But what happens is then the social group that has the dominant group becomes the norm, and everything else must conform. But if we say those things don't matter in terms of social power, that's very different. So I was in my sacramental spirituality class, we were reading this book about women leadership in the early church. And it talked about, it was a very nuanced view of women leaders in the early church. It was great. But one of the things that they highlighted was the social dynamics that were happening in these early house churches, where there was this new sense of equality, but it didn't exist beyond that church experience. Like the enslaved person could come in and receive a prophetic word and deliver the prophetic word to everyone, including their master. And then outside of that space, they were still enslaved. And then, of course, we see that tension playing out in the New Testament, where Paul is like, well, if you're enslaved, stay enslaved. Right? Paul thinks Jesus is about to come back any moment, so no need to cause a social upheaval. And as the church became more and more, uniformed instead of unity and diversity, we start to see even more of that. First Timothy, we see very clear instructions much later in the first century around women, around the way the church ought to be.
As a side note, can I just take a moment and say how much I hate it when people look at every line of the Bible as if it's a direct commandment from God and not like things requiring contextual analysis. I was reading a rabbi I follow on Twitter who just kind of ranted at someone at one point, like, look, we don't use the Psalms for instruction. That's not what those are for. Like, we talk about Paul, we talk about these epistles and stuff here. Aside from being highly contextual, they're not commandments for everybody's daily living everywhere. That's not what they're supposed to be. Sorry. And Rand, that one just kind of poked at me a second.
We got to do a conversation clearly on what is the Bible.
Yeah.
I mean, you and I talk about that enough. And so I bet that would be one that a lot of people would be interested in.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do it, please.
Absolutely.
Because if it were up to me, Paul would have no place in scripture.
Even after our Pauline hermeneutics class, JJ?
Spicy.
I'm just saying.
Can you
what
be
would
Christian
Dr.
and
Bowen
not
say
Paul?
to us?
Right.
Absolutely, because I can't stand Paul. So
I would argue for Paul's inclusion, but with more footnotes than Bart.
It's like
I would argue for the exclusion of Bart.
Well, I wasn't going to say that, but you're not wrong.
So going back to this, I love the way Lana put it, that this is not an either or situation. That like you said it much more poetically than I ever could in speaking to the paradox of individual and community. When I'm thinking about the individual piece, right? That ability to be an individual in the context of community is another reason why I can still call myself a Christian. because as time has gone along, I think I said this in the last podcast that we did around keeping Christ in Christmas. I've become more and more open about identifying as a universalist Christian. And if I had just defined my Christianity based on the way my community defined it, I would always be in the proverbial closet when it comes to that. But being able to see myself as an individual in relationship to my faith allows me to be able to nuance the definition of what it means to be a Christian for myself. So encountering theologians and pastors like Jackie Lewis, the pastor of Middle Collegiate Church. I remember the first time I heard her say in an interview that she was a Universalist Christian pastor. And I thought to myself, number one, as a Black woman, that takes a lot of guts. Because she was ordained, I believe, in the PCUSA. So like that's not a wide core doctrine of the PCUSA that they are universalists. So to claim that like so boldly, for me, gave me a sense of courage as an individual within the context of the Christian community, to be able to say, this may not be how everybody else relates to their Christianity, but I can stay within the framework of Christianity because it allows me to say, this is the way that I relate to God. This is the framework that opened God up to me in a way that makes God relatable, but only if I can claim that I am both universalist and Christian.
Yes. Like what you're saying, I feel like is so important because that's what it's supposed to be, right? The community mirror or demonstrates for you, like the claiming of an individual in community and you being able to relate to that and therefore claim your own identity even stronger. Like that's, I think, for me, the ideal use of that community. And that's the balance, I think, between the individualism and the community.
I think a key part of community is having a safe place to question.
Yeah.
Because again, it's not uniformity. We're not here to be just like the community. Because if that was the case, then we'd all be doing the same thing forever and always. But the reality is life is change. Life is impermanence. Christianity is change. Christianity is not permanent. Orthodoxy is a myth. And by myth, I don't mean that it doesn't exist. I mean that it's a myth in the way that race is a myth. It's something that's created to control, a myth is something we all believe in, that we hold to, that shapes our reality, but it doesn't have a basis in reality at the end of the day. Myths are powerful. I think the reality is that like I don't want to identify as Christian because of the myth of Christian orthodoxy, because of the myth of Christian evangelicalism in America. I don't want to identify as Christian because I don't want people to think who subscribe to the myth that that's what a Christian is, that I have to be that. And yet, that's again why I want to say that the tent is wider than that myth is just that. It's not real. I know that it holds a lot of cultural power. I know that it has shaped the way that we view the world. I know that it creates inequities in the world. And it's not real at the end of the day. And so it's our work to unravel the myth and tell the truth.
In unraveling that, one thing I want to call attention to is the challenge of counterbalancing. One thing you noted there, and this is the thing that stuck with me right at the beginning, you were talking about how it's important for us to create safe spaces for questioning in our communities, for our communities to be safe spaces for questioning. And that's something I strive to do a lot with the community I've been building here. But the one thing that I struggled with right off the bat when I was first starting to try to do this was that for a community to be a safe space for questioning, that also includes stupid questions. Like when we say we want to make this a safe space for questioning, we're like, okay, well, what about members of the LGBT community who are questioning the compatibility of their faith with their growing understanding of their self-identity? Of course. What about people from marginalized communities who are struggling with racism or sexism or misogyny or bias and all these other things? And there's great. What about these people who are like, here's a question I got the other day from someone who I'm obviously not going to name, who asked, he's like, I've been in this relationship with someone of a different faith, but the Bible says we can't be unequally yoked, so I have to definitely never talk to them again. Why is that? Like, okay, well, that's an objectively stupid question. The Bible does not actually give that as an outright command, but you have to be willing to ask it. I had a question from someone on our Discord server a year or two ago who was asking, how can I possibly exist in the same space with gay people because Leviticus? And I'm like, okay, all right. But being at a safe space for those questions too is the tension. And how do you balance that tension with people who are going to be hurt by people even asking those questions? That is the real challenge in trying to build this kind of community, I think.
Well, so I want to jump in here to answer that question.
Oh, please.
Not that I have a perfect answer, but I would say we have to. Lana has me thinking about Mythbusters now.
Yes.
I think we have to bust the myth of anything that is there is no such thing as a safe space.
Yes.
It is more accurate. I think it was Brene Brown who said there's no such thing as a safe space, but there's a brave space. And so to create a space for people to lean into bravery, to ask what some might consider stupid questions, to be able to say that, here's a space where we're not going to judge, even though we might judge you, under our breath and in the corner of our mind. We're not going to judge you out loud because we've created this brave space that welcomes you into questioning things about the faith. I think that doing that on the front end creates an opportunity for more authenticity, because I cannot tell you how many times I've been in communities of faith that have said that they were radically welcoming and so many other things. And then on the other side of it, been told a really racist joke or a really ableist joke or a very queer-phobic joke. And these were supposed to be safe spaces. And so I think we have to get away from telling the lie that our communities of faith are safe. We have to name at the front end that we strive to create spaces where people can be welcomed fully, as authentically as they are, but to be honest about the fact that with that comes bumps and bruises that I may not be able to shield you from, and naming that and being okay with it.
You reminded me, I'm gonna tell this story of my wife, who you guys, I think, all know, although if you're listening, you probably don't, but my wife is Japanese. And during our time in Princeton, we had a hard time finding a church to settle into. Because as you all know, pretty much every church in the Princeton area is like, we are a radically welcoming community. We want everybody. But it was hard because we'd like go to a church and we'd sit down and people would come talk to me and they would viciously just ignore her. And like, oh, we're scared type stuff. And, then we'd never come back. We'd move on to the next church, looking to see if any one of these churches was going to be as radically welcoming as they thought. Until finally we got to one, which was like, I don't know, a dozen churches and an internship and a half later. We got to one, which was honestly at first meet just the same as all the others. But my wife was a far better Christian, and indeed a far better pastor than I am in just about every measurable respect. I said, you know what? We're going to sit this one out for a bit. And we stayed there for 3 years. And am I going to say it was the greatest experience ever? No, there were ups and downs. Good moments and bad moments. She became part of the community in a way, and so did I. I lived there, worked there for years, and we moved on. But the next time someone from a different background came in, they were talked to like that. And that is like the result of that bravery. And this is one of the hardest things. I don't want to say hardest for me personally, because look, cis white American male, like nothing's ever going to be hard for me in this context. I'm sorry. But hard for me to witness with others, at least, is that oftentimes that bravery doesn't end up benefiting you in the moment. And that's one of the hardest pills to swallow, is that progress is often built on the backs of the oppressed in that way. And one of my personal struggles as, guy who is all that trying to preach liberation theology from this perspective is, how do you balance the tension between that fact and the fact that liberation and grace and relief is the main arc of the gospel? And I don't have an easy answer for that either, but there is a degree of non-safety and I think endurance that is required to change spaces like this, at least until we figure out a better option.
So I want to add another little nuance that a footnote I would just put on safe space. So yes, I think safe space is another myth. And I would say psychological safety is necessary for brave space. Psychological safety is not the same as a space, though, where you won't get hurt. Psychological safety is trust. It's a sense in which you know that you can make a mistake and it's not the end. It's a space in which you know that you can be held and you can try things out. It's a space where you can dare to do something different. You can be bold, you can be brave, but that takes time to build. It takes relationship and commitment and people being willing to change. Like you said, Don, it took people having to reposture the way that they interacted with people who were different.
Mm.
And oftentimes, right, in the myth of post-racial America, we don't even see that there's these things happening, because again, that myth is so strong that everybody's equal now. We're all like happy and dandy. But that myth prevents us from seeing what's happening right in front of us all the time.
I really appreciate that you offered the nuance of psychological safety. You offering that raises the question for me: is there anything redeemable in Christianity? And as I'm kind of letting that question roll around in my mind, I think that if Christianity is to be redeemed, we have to make it psychologically safe for people to lean into the faith of Christianity. And so I'm just sitting with that. I think especially on the heels of I won't even say on the heels of, because I think we're still in the midst of a global pandemic that most people are denying. Yeah, we have yet to see what the psychological ramifications of this is going to be. And so this has to push us to make our faith in some way, shape, or form psychologically safe, so that we are not vilifying folks who express that they are navigating mental health challenges. That this is a soapbox that has nothing to do with the episode, but I just thank you for putting it out there.
But it's important. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say I want to introduce a little bit of nuance to the term psychologically safe here too, particularly when we're talking about theological questioning and stuff like that. I'm not really qualified to speak on the more intense mental health aspects of the term, but I would say with psychologically safe existing within a Christian community, I would want to draw a differentiation between psychologically safe meaning an environment in which you are unchallenged, and psychologically safe as in an environment in which you may be challenged without risk of being destroyed by being challenged.
Yeah.
Because I know from experience,
Right.
there's a lot of people that would hear psychologically safe and immediately jump to that first definition and be like, yeah, JJ, you're totally right about all the things, which, you know, you are always and forever. You know, that's how I feel. But I want to make sure that other people are experiencing the nuance on that as well, because to be psychologically safe means to be in a space where growth is permitted and encouraged and supported, even with all the difficulties that may entail, and not to exist in a safe where you're in a space where you're not going to be hurt or attacked or challenged in any way.
Right. The exclusionary part of that, right? We're not going to exclude you because you're asking these things or doing these things.
We're not going to exclude you because you're an idiot, but we are going to tell you.
Right.
Yeah. And what you just said, JJ, I think brings us to another underlying question underneath the question of why are we still Christian is what is Christian? What is there to redeem? How do we think about that? And how do we define it?
There's another episode for us.
There's another episode.
Literally. I was like, are we supposed to answer this question right now? Because so sorry.
What if we each gave a 30-second spark note of why we're either in the ordination process or have completed the ordination process, aka sort of got married to the church in some ways. We sort of hitched our wagons together for the long haul.
Some of us more literally than others.
Yep.
Who wants to start off with their spark notes?
Can you repeat that again? So what's the question that we're answering? Sorry.
I hope I can get my brain to do that. I think basically what I want to know is, you know, all of us think deeply about our Christianity because I feel like this is sort of like we're upset because we care, right? We're upset because we like want the church to be a place where people know themselves in community. We want people to feel that individual love of God that like pours from everything we know and affirms us as we are, and that we have people around us who are the hand and feet of Christ, or, you know, whatever it is that you want to say about like how other people can bring that like God love into our lives. Like, why, amidst all of our pain about the church and, you know, like different parts of our faith journey, why still be Christian? Why call yourself one? 30 seconds is not nearly sufficient for that. But if someone were to ask you, you know, if a 4-year-old were to say, why are you a pastor? Or why are you a hospital chaplain? As if a 4-year-old would know what that is, because I didn't know until I was 24. But something along those lines.
I would say for me, going back to the context in which I grew up in, it was always said in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way that the pastor was a hope dealer. That they were hooking people week after week and keeping them addicted to something that could never, like, the need could never be fully met. So that's why people came back over and over and over again. And even though that was said in a very derogatory way, to speak to the vocation of pastoring, there was something about that that gripped my heart at a really young age, to want to be somebody who dealt hope on a regular basis. And even when I feel like I want to say I'm done with it all, I'm reminded of the fact that I am where I am because somebody dealt hope to me.
Mm.
And so I want to be one of those people who deal hope in the midst of chaos and despair.
I think my spark notes would probably be along a similar sort of line. The question, why am I a Christian, is because the Christian God, in my experience personally, but also in my reading up, is the clearest example of something that is beyond human understanding, that is at the source of all human understanding, that is fundamentally good and desires for the liberation of the oppressed and the care for people who are not cared for. And I have not seen that. That resonates with my soul personally, because I believe that there is something like that. Do I totally believe that the Christian expression of God is 100% right? Totally? No, I think it's the best one I've found so far. But yeah, I know I'm probably going to get demitted for that, but whatever. I think that is what it is, because that's God's goal, is to liberate, to care, to uplift, and to support all of God's wonderful creations in that way. And then to answer the question that my 4-year-old does ask me all the time, of why are you a pastor? Why are you a pastor? And about 97 times before dinner, because the work's not done. I mean, it's as simple as that. Is why are you a pastor? Because that work of liberation isn't done yet. It's the same as asking the question, why are you doing the dishes? Because they're not clean yet. Why are you doing the laundry? Because it's not done yet. Why are you a pastor? Because the work's not done. And I will be a pastor until the work's done, or until someone does a Palpatine and strikes me down and becomes more powerful than they could possibly imagine, whichever.
God's gonna call you home before that happens, honey. I think you have a good point. I'm a Christian because I was born in a particular context with a particular set of parents in a particular small town in Georgia. Like, that's why I was a Christian. That's how I was raised. And I think I continue to live into that faith and challenge, find my own ways for that, right? My community claimed my baptismal vows for me and raised me as a Christian. And so I think I continue to live that out in different ways. And I think part of that is recognizing the ways in which I've seen God limited, and wanting to continue to be surprised joyfully of the ways in which God loves people well and claims people. And I think I also have this idea that I think I live in a profession right now that I think I live in a profession where I function a lot in individualistic faith. Like, I encounter the raw questions that people have that they are unwilling to ask in their communities. And I want to be a part of the work of holding those questions, bearing witness to those questions, and being a part of communities in which we're going to continue to support them. Like, you know, we've been talking about being psychologically safe. I think that's the goal. Like that's sort of what I've been working towards. It's not really a concise answer. I continue, you know, why am I still a Christian? It continues to be unfolded to me, right? That's the journey. There's the answer.
I want to go ahead and say that thank you for saying that, because as someone who in this kind of missional, but although I hate that word, context, you know, constantly getting asked the question, you know, why are you a Christian? What does it mean to be a Christian? What is a Christian? I see people answer that question a lot, particularly evangelicals, because oh my God, this place is lousy with evangelicals right now. And I loathe it when people answer that question as if it's a fixed statement, as if it's a thing that I accomplished, a piece. It's like a master's degree or 6. It's a piece I tacked onto my identity a couple of years back. It exists at the end of my name: PhD, DMin, MSED, Christian. You know, down at the end of my title. I use it on emails every once in a while. You know, like that's not what it is. It's an ongoing process, and I think that anybody who doesn't say that isn't being entirely honest about what it means to be a Christian. Because if you're sitting in a place presenting as if you know all the answers, then you're wrong. I remember something my father once told me, for all of his conservatism when I was growing up, when we were having our religious debates. And boy, how my parents loathed the degree to which I would argue with them about church stuff. But in the middle of all of this, my dad asked a question that has stuck with me forever, which is, he said, you know, whether we agree or not, you have to keep asking yourself the question every time something comes up: why would God care about that? And if you're not constantly asking yourself that question, along with the Reddit favorite, am I the, I'm not sure if I can say that on this particular podcast, but you know what I mean. You know, as long as you're asking yourself that question or those two questions, then you're in the right. But if you're not constantly doing that, Virginia, you're dead on with that. And thank you so much for highlighting that. You have to be in transit. You have to be in motion. We need to talk more. I learned so much when I'm hanging out with you. Come on.
Likewise.
I just want to make clear that I answered Emmy's original question as to why we hitched our wagon to the church. So I noticed that everyone after me took it in a different direction. So I'm just adding that, you know, piece of clarity.
Do you want to add why you're a Christian, JJ? So
No, because I think I'm still figuring it out.
Yeah.
I'm a Christian today. I may not be tomorrow. And the next day I may be Christian again. So I think, in all honesty, it's in process. And being able to name that and being okay with it is what I'm learning to be okay with.
Amen. JJ, that was a healing thing to hear, coming from a fellow reverend, because I think 6 months ago when I got ordained, it was one of the greatest honors of my life, and sometimes is one of the heaviest weights of my life. You know, there are the obvious Bible verses about how teachers will be judged more harshly, and, you know, that you need someone wise, blah, 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 blah. But I mean, sometimes in having this title, it can feel very weighty of like, you know, I've never sat here and said I have all the answers, but, you know, if you have Reverend in your name, someone can probably accurately assume that at least today you feel like a Christian. And maybe that's not a great assumption all the time. And so I love that you gave the freedom of like, I call myself a Christian today. I might not be tomorrow, but I may be the day after. And so.
Well, I explained it to somebody once when I was having a very similar conversation. Christianity isn't a belief system, it's a framework. Christianity, even like full on the teachings of Jesus, is a framework by which we put ourselves in the presence of a God that we fundamentally do not understand. So if I could hop in a TARDIS, go back in time and discover that Jesus, the human on earth, fundamentally never existed, that would change my framework, but it wouldn't change my belief in God. I would just have to fundamentally reappraise the degree to which I understood God. I was like, wow, that's far less than the little I thought I understood God in the first place. But I think that is, as teachers, a healthy way for us to understand that, is that our Christianity is a framework. It is to our minds. I think we're all generally more or less in agreement, at least today, that it's kind of the best framework we have to hand. But it is just that. It's a framework. It's the tool that we're using to understand our relationship with God. It's our navigational chart. All right, God's out in that general direction. We're trying to be more God-like. We're going in that direction. This is the chart we're using. And if we wake up tomorrow and this chart's wrong, well, we're just going to set a new course. Because God is still there, regardless of whether we understand God correctly or not.
Amy, did you want to add? Oh, no, you're good. Did you want to add any other things to your answer about why you chose ordination, why you chose this path?
Sorry, did you say me?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go ahead and be very Presbyterian for a second, say it chose me. And that sounds like such a cop-out, but I think it's closer to the truth. I think I had my own moments along the journey that were just so improbable. And I'm like, okay, I'm paying attention. I'm going to keep walking. As you said, I think I'm headed in this direction. And it seems like, what I believe I understand about God seems to be pointing me in this direction. And it just sort of happened over time. I knew I wanted to work as a hospital chaplain before I knew that you had to do seminary for that. I initially thought medical social work, and then I thought hospital chaplain because a friend said, I think you'd be really good at this. And I was like, oh my gosh, that looks so cool. And I have to do that education for that? Nah. And then 8 days later, during an impromptu interview with the school, I got in. And they were like, just go home and submit your application. You know the answer already. I was just like, excuse me? So there have been these very random moments where it's like, okay, you don't typically show up for a campus visit and end up with no worries. And we know the application deadline is passed, but you can look forward to an acceptance letter in your inbox once you send your materials our way. And I thought I for sure had misheard. And so I wrote my application and was like, cool. An hour and a half later, welcome to Princeton Theological Seminary. Gosh, they weren't kidding. And so there are these improbable moments that I think lead me closer toward the presence of the God that I don't fully know and want to know more with every passing year, and hopefully even every passing day, I learn something more. I know I learned way more about God tonight with you guys, and I'm so grateful for that. This is part of why community is important, is people are able to express things in ways that you can't, and sometimes you've got the dish soap or the laundry detergent, and you're like, I have work that I can do, right? This work is not done, and I see myself fitting in this way. And so for whatever reason, ordination was part of I see myself fitting in this way. And it's been so interesting for me to see what God does with people who are interested in one particular ministry and then may open up their eyes to different ones, or just so many different things. But long story short, I love having the title of Reverend because it reminds me of the community, that brave space, who love me as I am and have always pushed me to be more. Ever since I met them in my early 20s, they've been so affirming and also like, girl, you were born yesterday. Let's teach you something. Great. I want to learn. I'm 28 and a half. That's it. And I love that in each of our different walks, you know, you don't, dear listener, you don't need to be either in the ordination track or ordained in order to be able to teach something about God to someone else. Whether or not you have an official title, you have a place. And if you haven't found your place yet, keep searching. It's not as far away as you think.
As a side note, and you can feel free to edit this out later if you're sick of me ranting so much or if it's completely off topic. Note how I'm pausing here to give you room to do exactly that. I never really appreciated just how similar our stories were, just stretched out over different lengths of time. Because I kind of realized that I was going to be a pastor when I was in, I think, 7th or 8th grade. My church that I was growing up in got a new pastor, and this was a guy who was all, we hate the gays, we got to get these Indians out of town, you know, we don't like people who don't look like us. Really hardcore. Just like he came down on my dad because he was poor, all sorts of just gatekeeping bias crap. And I kind of had a moment where I'm in there as like a 7th or 8th grade. I'm like, this guy is an idiot. I could do this job better. I think I should probably do this job. And that went on for like the better part of a year until I realized the sheer amount of degrees that my growing up poor self would have had to acquire to do it. At which point I said, oh yeah, well, I'm gonna leave that up to God then. And it wasn't until a decade and a half of insane God-only coincidences that I wound up at Princeton Seminary, you know, studying to actually do the thing. But that, it just blows my mind every once in a while. You know, you and I've known each other for a while. I did not realize that we had that same sort of, I want to do the thing, but I need all the other stuff to do the thing. Oh, well. Oh, really? God, really? Seriously? You sure about that? Oh, that too? Really? Okay, then. Like the journey towards being a pastor, I've told many people, is one of abject confusion. Like you don't walk proudly and dignifiedly into being a pastor. You stumble screaming like a drunken monkey going down a water slide at 4 a.m, and you wind up as a pastor at the bottom soaking wet, wondering what in the name of God just happened to me. Anyway, that's my clarification on that.
Amen. What in the name of God has happened in this?
Literally.
To each of us and to you, dear listener. What in the name of God is that improbable sort of push towards something beautiful that's not yet realized, or something challenging where you know that it needs to be uprooted so that something better can be put in its place? These different little moments that are, it sounds like all of us could agree, like in this, I think all of our participants here could agree, like there's some stuff that happens that's beyond our power. And that's part of why we are interested and curious and keep our hearts open and look around, perceive what's around us in some ways or other, because it's fascinating and it's hard, and there are problems in the tent all over the place, and there are moments when you just want to throw everything out the window and start a new life somewhere. or is that just me?
As someone who did exactly that, it still follows you.
No matter where you go, there you are.
Yep.
Okay. But yeah.
Yeah, avoidance doesn't help very much.
Yeah. It's all challenging, and there's beauty in it, and I'm glad to hear stories of why you guys still believe in God, because it's good to hear those every once in a while.
I don't know about y'all, but I'm a Christian because the Lord Jesus Christ saved me in my nanny's bedroom when I was 10 years old, and I prayed the prayer of salvation.
But honey, how many times did you pray that prayer?
No, I knew that the Lord saved me then. I mean, I did doubt it because my nanny then sent me a book called like Christian something for teens or something, The Way of Jesus for Teens. I don't know. And of course, reading it, I was like, oh my God. I used to believe that if I didn't say amen at the end of my prayers, they weren't heard.
They weren't considered prayers, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so I was neurotic. I would be talking to my best friend and I would be like, amen. And he was like, what are you doing? I was like, nothing.
It's like a tick at that point.
You know that there is some studies that show a correlation between high anxiety and high religiosity. So just saying.
Oh, my dear sweet darling, are you even a Christian if you don't pray that prayer of salvation and then a purity ring magically appears on your finger?
I did get that eventually. Had a ceremony and everything.
Oh, I think we've all been there.
Mhm. Not Emmy. Emmy was spared.
Emmy was.
Oh. As a
But,
side note, I'll share this with you guys, maybe give you a little kick of it. I actually, and I'm surprisingly stuck on here right now, but I actually still have mine.
Oh my gosh.
I actually still keep it around. Because, all right, I'm gonna be a little direct here, and again, feel free to edit it out if you want later. I did the whole purity ring thing when I had my first girlfriend and all that. This is to remember, who I'm adhering to first. And it took me 4 hours between putting the thing on, doing the whole kind of ceremonial thing, and then losing something else that was supposedly of some import. Starts with a V. You can guess the direction we're going from there. And I kept it around after that because it serves as a heck of a good reminder to me the difference between these stupid constructs we put on ourselves and the absolute glory that God has built into our relationships with other people. And yes, I understood that in the mind of a 12-year-old, or not 12, how old was that? Like 16, 18, however old I was. Yeah, sorry. I don't know where that number came from. An 18-year-old who had just figured out, oh, that's what that's all about. But the memory of how important it is that our religiosity constructs bear no resemblance to what God has built our reality to be.
Thanks be to God.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, feel free to edit that bit out because it was random and I screwed up a number, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, that does tie into, I'll close us on this note because it is getting late, but what my answer for why I am ordained. And I think for me, it does have to do with this, I'll take JJ's phrase, I'm a myth buster. I feel part of my calling is to recognize the realities that shape our lives and to be able to unpack them in such a way that people can realize that they don't have to follow that reality anymore. And then in response, we are invited to reimagine a new world. We are invited to the prophetic imagination that Walter Brueggemann talks about. We're invited to imagine a world where we can be as we are and do it together and actually connect. So my core value is connection to self, other, sacred, and the earth. And so how do we live that out? And I think that's what I'm trying to do as a clergy, is make that happen. Well, thank you all so much for being here tonight. Thank you for sparing your time and sharing your thoughts. And I mean, seriously, these are great conversations. Hopefully we'll have another one in 2-ish weeks or so. And if anyone has some topics, it sounds like some things may have bubbled up. What is Christianity? What is the Bible? Any other things? Please, please, please let us know what you want to talk about.
A 4-part series. Why evangelicals are wrong. Parts 1, 2, 3, 4.
Purity culture and the shame.
Oh God, yes.
Purity culture.
That would be a great topic. I think that's one that many people could relate to.
Mm-hmm.
I could just
one of our
keep
podcasts
listening.
a while back.
I just want to throw out there before we log off. I was really looking forward to this conversation today, primarily because I have been wrestling with whether or not I still want to call myself a Christian.
Mm.
And that may sound antithetical to being called a reverend. But it's not, because there are folks who bear the title reverend who are not necessarily Christian, or who are not Christian at all. But part of the reason why I was looking forward to this conversation was to hear from other people. Why the hell do you continue to hold on to this? And hoping and praying that it would stir in me some sort of hope to keep holding on in the midst of what has seemed to be a very hopeless situation. So I say all of that to say that you all have done a masterful job of being vulnerable and being honest about your journeys, and hearing the ways in which we all have wrestled with, how it is that we continue to lean into this faith framework, has been a blessing to me. So I just wanted to go on record and say thank you for strengthening my faith in ways that you may not even know you have done.
Thank you, JJ.
Yeah, thank
I
you.
came with the same hope. Amen.
I got to be honest, the group of you always strengthen my faith whenever we manage to talk, whether it's on the record or not. You guys are all wonderful people, and I am blessed to be in your presence anytime you'll have me.
Likewise.
Amen.
My little heart grew 3 sizes. And that's God, isn't it? That's God.